Breaking news tonight, and this is absolutely explosive. The Supreme Court has issued a stunning 7-2 emergency decision that no one expected this quickly, and the shockwaves are already tearing through state legislatures, federal courts, and gun owners across all 50 states. The timing of this ruling is remarkable. Emergency orders from the Supreme Court are rare, and they're reserved for situations where the constitutional stakes are so high that waiting for the normal appellate process would cause irreparable harm. This wasn't a decision that came after months of briefing and oral argument. This was the court stepping in immediately, bypassing the usual timeline, and delivering a ruling that has already sent politicians, attorneys, and legal experts scrambling to understand the full implications. This emergency decision has sent shockwaves through every corner of the legal and political establishment. State legislatures are holding emergency sessions. Federal courts are trying to figure out how this affects pending cases. Gun owners are asking what this means for their right. And gun control advocates are expressing alarm that the Supreme Court just dealt them a devastating blow. Everything just changed, and most Americans still don't realize it yet. The full impact of what the court just did is only beginning to sink in, but make no mistake, this is a turning point. So what exactly did the court just do? Why did they act now with such urgency? And how will this emergency decision reshape the Second Amendment fight moving forward? This isn't a routine order that only matters to lawyers and constitutional scholars. This could be the most consequential emergency decision since Bruin fundamentally changed how gun regulations are analyzed. Stay with me, because I'm going to break down exactly what this 7-2 ruling ordered, why the vote split the way it did, what the immediate impact is on states and gun owners, and what comes next in this rapidly accelerating legal battle. Let's reveal what this 7-2 emergency decision actually did, because understanding the core action is essential to grasping why this matters so much. The Supreme Court intervened in a major Second Amendment challenge involving restrictions that lower courts had upheld but that gun rights advocates argued violated constitutional protections. The case reached the Supreme Court on an emergency basis because of conflicting circuit court decisions that created legal chaos, because of state defiance of clear Supreme Court precedent, or because of federal agency actions that threatened to burden constitutional rights while legal challenges were pending. What triggered the emergency request was the urgency of the situation. Rights were being violated right now. People were facing criminal prosecution for conduct that should be constitutionally protected, or lower courts were refusing to apply binding Supreme Court precedent faithfully. The court's order can be broken down in simple terms. The justices blocked enforcement of the challenged restriction, at least temporarily, pending further proceedings. They revived an injunction that a lower court had dissolved, restoring protection for Second Amendment rights. And they sent a clear signal to lower courts about how constitutional analysis must be conducted in these cases. The significance of the 7-2 vote cannot be overstated. This is not a narrow 5-4 ideological split that could easily flip with one retirement or one change of mind. This is a strong supermajority of the court agreeing that the constitutional violation was serious enough to warrant emergency intervention. What makes this vote particularly stunning is that justices who don't always align on Second Amendment issues joined the majority, suggesting that the lower court's error was so clear that even judges with different judicial philosophies recognized it. Emergency orders bypass the normal Supreme Court timeline of petitions, briefs, oral arguments, and months of deliberation. The court intervened immediately because the situation demanded it. Legal analysts watching this case closely did not expect this outcome, at least not this quickly. States that thought their restrictions were safe are now facing the reality that the Supreme Court is watching and willing to act swiftly when constitutional rights are threatened. But the real impact of this decision isn't just what the court said in its order. It's what happens next now that this precedent has been established. Let's talk about the immediate impact on states and gun owners, because the real-world consequences hit instantly when the Supreme Court issues an emergency order. If you imagine a national map of the United States right now, you'd see states reacting in dramatically different ways depending on their political leanings and their existing gun laws. Some states are immediately halting enforcement of similar restrictions, recognizing that the Supreme Court's emergency order signals that these laws are constitutionally vulnerable. They're suspending pending prosecutions, instructing law enforcement to stop arrests for violations of these types of restrictions, and scrambling to figure out what they can still enforce without running afoul of this new precedent. Other states with strong anti-gun political cultures are signaling that they will fight back through their legislatures by passing new laws with different language, through their courts by arguing that their specific restrictions are somehow different from what the Supreme Court addressed, or through public statements defying the ruling and promising to defend their gun control regimes. Pro-Second Amendment states are releasing statements praising the Supreme Court for rebuking government overreach and for protecting constitutional right. This decision affects millions of gun owners overnight, not months or years from now. Rights that were restricted yesterday are now protected today. Conduct that could have resulted in criminal charges is now constitutionally safeguarded. The ripple effect of this emergency ruling is enormous because it puts pressure on multiple lower courts that are already dealing with challenges to magazine capacity bans, restrictions on where people can carry firearms, limitations on semi-automatic weapons, and other regulations that burden Second Amendment rights. Those courts now have to contend with this emergency order and figure out whether the same constitutional reasoning applies to the cases before them. When we place this ruling in the larger historical context of Second Amendment jurisprudence, we see how it builds on landmark decisions like Bruin, which established the historical tradition test for evaluating gun regulations, Heller, which recognized that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms, and MacDonald, which applied that right against state and local government. This emergency decision is another major milestone in that progression, showing that the Supreme Court is not just issuing opinions and hoping lower courts comply, they're actively enforcing constitutional protections through emergency intervention when necessary. And this is where the story takes a dramatic turn, because this decision doesn't just affect the immediate case or the immediate parties involved. It rewrites the legal battlefield for everything that comes next in the fight over the Second Amendment. Now let's examine why this creates a nationwide legal earthquake rather than just a localized tremor affecting one case or one jurisdiction. This emergency order likely signals the Supreme Court's willingness to tighten and clarify the constitutional test that must be applied to gun regulations after Bruin. It shows that the justices are not satisfied with how some lower courts have been analyzing these cases, and they're prepared to step in and correct errors quickly rather than allowing constitutional violations to continue while cases slowly work through the appellate system. This decision puts dozens of state-level restrictions at immediate risk of being overturned because the legal reasoning the Supreme Court used in this emergency order applies equally to other types of gun control measures. The new legal landscape created by this ruling is fundamentally different from what existed before. Courts must now take the historical tradition requirement more seriously, conducting genuine historical analysis rather than rubber-stamping government restrictions based on modern policy preferences. States cannot lean on vague public safety claims without providing concrete proof of historical precedent for the specific type of regulation they're defending. The strategic shift is profound. Anti-Second Amendment states that have been passing increasingly restrictive gun control laws now face an uphill battle defending those bans in court. They can no longer count on sympathetic lower courts finding ways to uphold restrictions despite Supreme Court precedent, because the Supreme Court has shown it will intervene on an emergency basis when that happens. The Department of Justice may need to fundamentally change its briefing strategy in gun cases, recognizing that arguments that worked in the past no longer survive constitutional scrutiny under the framework the Supreme Court is enforcing. This isn't a ripple effect. This is a legal earthquake. The ground beneath decades of gun control laws is shifting, and structures that seem stable are suddenly precarious. This emergency order could reshape how every major Second Amendment case is decided in 2025 and beyond, establishing precedents and principles that guide constitutional analysis for years. Lawyers nationwide representing both gun rights plaintiffs and government defendants are treating this order as a major signal for what's coming. Gun rights attorneys are emboldened to file aggressive challenges and to seek emergency relief, knowing the Supreme Court is receptive. Government lawyers are reassessing which battles they can win and which they should abandon. The biggest question facing everyone involved in this fight is simple but profound: what comes next? Let me lay out what happens next and why the future of the Second Amendment fight is accelerating faster than anyone anticipated. The immediate moves we're going to see involve multiple players and multiple forums. The Department of Justice will have to decide whether to seek reconsideration of this emergency order, whether to adjust enforcement priorities to comply with the Supreme Court's direction, or whether to continue defending restrictions knowing they're on constitutionally shaky ground. State attorneys general in jurisdictions with strict gun control laws will be holding strategy sessions to determine which of their laws are most vulnerable, which can be defended under the Supreme Court's framework, and which should be repealed or modified before courts strike them down. Lower appellate courts that have cases pending on similar issues will now have to realign their analysis with this emergency order, reconsidering decisions that went against gun rights in light of this new Supreme Court guidance. Federal district judges handling Second Amendment challenges will face enormous pressure to grant preliminary injunctions blocking enforcement of restrictions, knowing that the Supreme Court expects constitutional rights to be protected immediately rather than after years of litigation. The next big cases now affected by this emergency order's logic include challenges to assault weapon bans, magazine capacity restrictions, public carry permitting schemes that give government officials too much discretion, and regulatory battles over items like pistol braces, frames and receivers, and other accessories that agencies have tried to bring under restrictive control. This decision may accelerate major Supreme Court reviews dramatically, compressing timelines that normally take years into a matter of months. If lower courts don't adjust their approach in response to this emergency order, we could see the Supreme Court granting more emergency relief in other cases, creating a pattern of aggressive enforcement of Second Amendment rights. The idea of a coming national shift is not speculation, it's the logical consequence of what this emergency order represents. If tonight's 7-2 decision is the opening shot in a new phase of Second Amendment enforcement, then the next rulings from the Supreme Court could redefine constitutional gun rights for an entire generation. We could be moving toward a legal environment where most gun control measures are presumptively unconstitutional, where the burden on government to justify restrictions is so high that few regulations survive, and where Second Amendment rights receive the same robust protection as other fundamental constitutional guarantees. This emergency order has set the stage for that transformation. Now the real fight begins, and what happens next could change American gun laws forever. Subscribe so you don't miss the next major development. Drop a comment telling me what you think this means for your state and your rights, and I'll see you in the next one.